pray. O Lord, you have taught us the way, and yet sometimes we are reluctant. Help us to not be afraid to launch out into the deep in our lives, knowing that we will be blessed with abundance. Amen. Well, on a cold winter morning up in Wisconsin, not far from Wausau, the church my wife and I used to serve, a couple men figured that they'd go out to do some ice fishing. Now, you have to understand, if you're living in Wisconsin, you have to be into ice fishing. It's like the bar mitzvah for Protestants. It's like a rite of initiation for young people. And so that's something even the men in the men's group do, at least in the winter, which is about 10 months out of the year in Wisconsin where we live. And so the men found a nice patch of ice and they proceeded to chip a hole in it, and they lowered their lines. But about a minute later, they heard a booming voice saying, "There are no fish there." So the two men looked at each other and they wondered whose voice it was. They figured it'd be best if they moved over a little bit and tried their luck. So they went about 10 yards and they chipped another hole in the ice and they began to fish there. But once more they heard a booming voice say, "I tell you again, there are no fish there." And so the two men looked at each other in consternation, not knowing whose voice they were hearing. Remember now that ice fishing is a religious experience in Wisconsin. So one more time, they moved over about 10 yards. They chipped another hole in the ice. They dropped their lines down in the hole. But once more, they heard this booming voice saying, "There are no fish there." And so very timidly, one of the men looked up to the sky and said, "Is that you, God?" And the voice answered, "No, this is the owner of the ice skating rink. And I'm trying to tell you, there are no fish here." Well, that's my Wisconsin fishing joke for where I used to live. Oak could probably tell you some interesting stories about ice fishing in Wisconsin. You'll have to ask them later on. Well, today's gospel reading is about 3 discouraged men. 4 actually, if you count Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, who appears in other accounts of this story. And they were fishermen, not recreational fishermen, but commercial fishermen whose families went hungry if there was no catch. And Jesus had met them before when they were associated with John the Baptist. In fact, he had been to Simon Peter's house and cured his mother-in-law of a high fever. Well, it was a bad day for these 4 fishermen. They had fished all night and caught nothing. And now it was morning, and the men were washing their nets so that they would be ready for the next night's work. And there was a crowd on the beach near where they were working. It was a big crowd. And they were listening to Jesus. They were pressing in on him on every side. And Jesus was in the water, out a ways from the crowd, in a boat that he had borrowed from Simon. And it was customary, very often, he would sit down in the boat, just a little bit offshore, when he taught the people. And finally, after what must have seemed like hours to Simon, Jesus was done, and the crowd went home. And Jesus then turned to Simon Peter and said, "Put out into the deep water," he told them, "and let your nets down for a catch." Peter answered Jesus immediately by explaining the facts of fishing to him. Probably thought Jesus didn't know much about fishing. It won't do any good, Peter said, shaking his head. We have worked all night and have caught nothing. There's no point to it. Have you ever been there? Like Peter, you do your best, you work hard, and the results are zero. Like an important relationship goes sour, there's nothing you can do. You watch a marriage dissolve and you can't save it. You watch a loved one destroy themselves through alcohol or drugs, and there's nothing you can do. A project you have worked on just does not pan out. And the harder you try, the less the results. Have you ever been in a place when all your instincts tell you just to give up and go home? You're tired and you're worn out, and that's all you really want to do is go home. The last thing you want to hear are the words, you need to try harder. Peter and Andrew, James and John, these were not stupid men. Their families had been working the lake as fishermen for generations. They knew where to fish. They knew the right time to fish. They had done all the right things, and yet they came up empty. But Jesus was in the boat, and he insisted that they try one more time. Try over there in the deep water, he said. Let down your nets for a catch, Jesus said. What does he know about fishing, they wondered. But Simon thought, well, what do we have to lose? So he agreed to launch out into the deeper water. Why he did, we don't know. But amazingly, when he had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break and the boat was about to sink. It was an amazing catch, a catch taken where there should have been no fish, but there it was. It was a miracle to these men. Yet a successful catch was just the beginning of Jesus' ministry and many miracles. Moments later, Simon, all excited, along with James and John, they left their boats. They left everything behind on the shoreline, left their families and friends, and were told that they followed Jesus. Do not be afraid, Jesus told Simon. Easy for him to say. From now on, you will be catching people. The Greek word here is zogron, which means to capture or take alive. It wouldn't be long until the day of Pentecost, a time when Jesus' promise for Peter would begin in earnest. Peter would preach a sermon, and 3,000 people would be baptized in one day. And that was just the beginning. That work continues today. We are all Peter's heirs, proclaiming the gospel and sharing the good news with others. I wonder, what made Simon do it? What made him cast his net one more time against his better judgment? Was it the healing that took place in his own household this days before? Was it the power of Jesus' teaching there in Simon's own boat? Jesus had the unique ability to provide provocative alternatives to people. Alternatives that almost always fly in the face of conventional worldly wisdom. Jesus also had the power to persuade people to consider acting in new ways. He helped people know that they were no longer bound by their past, by tradition, by comfortable routines, their usual way of doing things. And so as he sat in the boat, Jesus helped Simon Peter know that things could be different. things would be different if they just trusted him. And today he does the same for you and me. No matter what you've done before, or how many times you feel like you've failed, Jesus invites you to cast your net into the deep one more time. If you're willing to trust God, the surprises in store for you are greater than anything you could ever imagine. Just ask Simon. Very soon, Jesus would begin referring to Simon as Peter, from the Greek word Petra, which means rock. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Peter is just one among many whom God has called and used throughout the Bible and throughout history. Just about every time God called upon someone to do God's work, the response was the same. There was doubt. People felt unworthy and unqualified to do God's bidding. Think of Isaiah, Moses, Simon Peter, and Paul, just to name a few examples. And what surprised them most was not what they were able to accomplish on their own, but rather they learned what incredible things God could do through them. He could use them. It wasn't just about them, but about what God could do through them. There are people like that right here in our own church that I'm sure you've all experienced. Don't worry about being equipped or qualified for the task. God doesn't choose the successful, the wealthy, or the powerful to be his disciples. But rather, God uses ordinary, everyday people to carry out the work of the kingdom. Someone once said, God does not call the equipped, but God equips the called. God does not call the equipped, but equips the called. It was certainly true for Peter, and it's true for you and me. God can use you right where you are, right now. The work you do every day is holy work. In the house, at work, in the yard, or at board meetings. In God's hands, everyday tasks are opportunities for revelation, discovery, and faith. Once you put yourself in God's hands, you will be blessed. And what's more, you'll be a blessing to others. I sometimes felt like Simon Peter when my wife and I started the new church in Sacramento. It was not always clear what we were supposed to do or what would work. We had never done that before. But God used us. We just trusted, and God used us. And used the people who came to build the church, and many people felt blessed and found meaning. The church grew and met the needs of the people, including many young families. It was the second fastest growing school district in the country, Sacramento. And many young families came and brought their children. But still in all, there were times when we felt like our nets were empty and the direction was unclear. There were other times when my nets felt empty, like when my father died at 57 from liver cancer and darkness surrounded me for a season, or when our older son Jackson's identical twin brother died at birth, or more recently, when my wife and I decided to move to California without knowing where we were going to land or what we were going to do for a job. And I'm sure all of you have your share of empty net stories too. It might seem like there are times when our nets are more empty than full. But when our nets are empty, here's the amazing thing. That's when we can turn our lives over to the master fisherman and the one who is familiar with the deep waters. It's time to trust him. There will be months and years ahead when God will ask you to launch out into the deep waters, both individually and as a church. So put your nets down. Do not be afraid to put your nets down into the deep and unchartered waters. I don't know what you will discover, but I do know who will be your guide, and he's a pretty good fisherman. God is not done with First Congregational Church. I will pray for you that you will not be afraid to launch out into the deep waters and put down your nets and catch people, fish for people. Like Simon Peter, may you find abundance and the willingness to follow him. Amen.